Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
Coming up on To the Contrary, Pope Francis calls for progressive changes for women and LGBTQ plus Catholics. How will conservative American Catholics react? Hello, I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to the Contrary, a weekly discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, the role of women and diverse communities in the church. Pope Francis is pushing the Catholic Church toward change, advocating for inclusivity as an historic Synod of Bishops is held at the Vatican. This pivotal gathering has sparked heated debates among progressive and traditional leaders. Under consideration at this important synod, blessings for same-sex couples, female deacons, whether to continue with priest celibacy, LGBT acceptance, and other issues. For the first time, women and lay people will be able to vote alongside bishops. Pope Francis recently made headlines for changing some church policies. He has said that priests may bless same-sex unions, a reversal from church doctrine issued in 2021, which said, quote, God cannot bless sin, end quote. Conservative critics have accused Pope Francis of poisoning the church with this synod. Joining us today are former judge and federal prosecutor Debra Carnahan, Republican strategist Ann Stone, political columnist for The Hollywood Reporter Keli Goff, and Carrie Sheffield, senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. All right, first question to you, Debra Carnahan. Are these changes that have to be made to keep the churches full in educated countries like in Europe, like in the United States?
I think that's probably why they're talking about it, Bonnie, because there is evidence that they need to do that. The church is growing more in the Southern Hemisphere. It's declining more in the Northern countries and the more educated countries. And it just really marginalizes a huge group, which is women. And they're not marginalized that way in other organizations, in these more progressive countries. So, yeah, I think they do. And that's why they're having a synod about it.
Carrie Sheffield, your thoughts about how conservative Catholics might respond to if these changes are made. And we should note that they're at least a year away from even voting on them, and implementation would be years down the road after that. So as one of my best friends who's Catholic told me, they didn't forgive Galileo for saying the earth was round for 500 years. He was excommunicated. So they tend to take their time on making changes.
Well, I was born on Galileo's birthday, so I feel a special affinity for him. But no, I don't have a dog in this fight because I am Protestant. In 1517, there was a guy named Martin Luther who I partly agreed with. But when you look at the state of the church in America and the West, overall, since Pope Francis, he's been in his popeship for 10 years, it hasn't really helped the Catholic Church because he has been very outspoken and he's done a number of things that have already angered conservative Catholics. So I don't think, and it has not helped the pews. So I think this could actually have a backlash. And I think a good analogy here is the Episcopal Church, to which I am a member, which has become very liberal in recent years, but that has not helped the decline of the Episcopal Church. And in fact, we've had more schisms within the Episcopal Church. And as someone who's conservative, there are certain Episcopal churches that I just don't feel comfortable in, and I will not attend. So,
Methodism has pretty much split over this issue or these types of issues, particularly gay rights in the church, whereas the American congregations tend to be welcoming, as they call themselves. The African congregations are definitely not. And so the church is splitting apart. Could that happen to Catholicism?
I think it very well could, and that's why I think they should tread very lightly here. I think it could blow up in his face. I don't think that Pope Francis should make these sudden changes. You have a lot of Catholics who are still upset about Vatican II, which happened, in our lifetimes of some people, still here in America. So again, there are changes that I do agree with as a Protestant, but there are some changes that I don't agree with. And overall, I think he has to tread very lightly.
Well, I'm a member of Martin Luther's flock. I'm a Lutheran. And I have to say that one of the things he split with the church over was about the involvement of women, the right to marry, but also women as congregants and officiants. And I think the church has to go back there. The Catholic Church was much more welcoming of women early on. And a lot of the things that this Pope's talking about are things that actually the church in its beginnings did practice. Gay rights, it's going to take a while for the church to catch up. But since most of the rest of the Christian world has already gone that route, I think it's necessary. And the church is supposed to be about love and about forgiveness and about, really anyone who accepts Jesus Christ and believes in God should be welcome. So I think it's going to be a positive step. My Catholic friends, by and large, hate it and really don't like this Pope. So it's going to be interesting.
When you say it accepted women, are you talking about the paintings down in the catacombs?
No, I'm talking about, early on, Mary Magdalene and others were a lot more revered in the early part of the church than they are now. So women were sidelined and ostracized in the interest of power. Married priests were stopped because they had to split their property between their family and the church. Church didn't like that, so they did away with marriage for priests. So a lot of it's been practical and cultural through the years. Now they need to evolve back to be practical and cultural.
A couple stats I just wanted to rattle off that apply to this, Bonnie, is that back in 1972, 90% of Americans identified as Christians. Today, that number is about 64%. The fastest growing demographic of religiously unaffiliated are former Catholics and African Americans. So just think about those stats for a moment. And it's an issue I've been fascinated by because I was raised in the church and I did what a lot of people do, which is I went through a bit of a drift of not going as often in my 20s. And now I'm back and fully engaged in a church. And when looking at why I became less active in researching for this segment in particular, one of the things I found that came up was a lack of acceptance of LGBTQ people. Baptist News published a study on this. I am not someone who is LGBTQ myself, but I reflected and realized that there was a gulf there because I was raised in a way that I think would be defined as homophobic today. I've written about probably describing myself as a recovering homophobe. And I wanted to go to churches where my gay friends feel welcome, right? So while the number of people going to churches is actually declining, what I've seen at some of the churches that I regularly visit, such as Marble and Middle Collegiate here in New York and Hollywood United Methodist in Los Angeles, they're actually growing. And one of the reasons they're growing is because they are legitimately diverse in terms of race, which is important to someone like me. Churches remain one of the most segregated places in America today. And they are diverse in terms of the families that they welcome. The pastor at Middle Collegiate, he said he was asked by other pastors around the country, why is your church so racially diverse? And he said, because we don't pay lip service to it. We actually engage in the behavior that makes different kinds of people, not just liberals, not just conservatives, not just blacks, not just white, feel legitimately welcome. You have other evangelical leaders, meanwhile, who would never, ever support a candidate who was gay, who talked about grabbing men's private parts, who supported a candidate, Donald Trump, who talked about grabbing women's private parts. It's really hard for someone like me to make the case, right, that the church is a place of love and welcoming when you have that kind of hypocrisy in the dichotomy. I actually had someone say to me, Bonnie, I didn't know you were a churchgoer. You seem like a nice person. If that doesn't say that religious people in America need a rebranding, Catholics and Protestants alike, I don't know what else does.
What would you say to Carrie's point, though, that a lot of people are going to, well, she believes the church numbers are dropping. I've seen that it's a trend that's been going on for quite some time now, especially in Europe.
Well, we didn't talk about the elephant in the room, Bonnie. We didn't talk about the elephant in the room,
Who's
which is
that?
the Catholic Church sex abuse scandal.
Right.
So I actually think the first step in the process is for churches to acknowledge it, where they've gotten things wrong, and then listen and see where they can rebuild trust. Because I know of more than one person, Bonnie, who said the reason that they left the Catholic Church is a friend of theirs was molested as a child and nothing was done about it. If we can't have these kind of honest conversations, then I think churches don't deserve to get people to come back.
But does anybody think that people, after the church pedophilia scandal, does anybody think, no matter how much reform is put in place, and not even under this Pope, who's by far the most liberal, at least in the last 50 years, do we believe that people would come back and trust the church again? Or just say, the heck with it, I've gone, I'm a non-believer now, and I'm done with the church. Carrie, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'm really glad we're talking about this because I actually have a memoir coming out. It's being published by Hachette on March 12th, and it is in part a spiritual memoir. So my publisher, it's the third largest publisher in the world. They're calling it a cross between Hillbilly Elegy and Educated by Tara Westover. Tara Westover sold 8 million copies of her book. It came out in 2018. And she was raised in a very abusive Mormon cult environment and put herself through Brigham Young University and got a full scholarship to Cambridge. I was raised in a very abusive Mormon cult environment, put myself through BYU and got a full scholarship to Harvard. And I was disowned by my father. My father said if I left the cult that Jesus wanted to be raped and murdered. He said that my blood changed when I did leave home. He said that I tried to seduce one of my schizophrenic brothers to rape me. And one of my schizophrenic brothers, my other one, actually did try to rape me and sexually assaulted me. And my dad didn't do anything about it. And so I had to leave. I had to make that choice. I suffered from a lot of PTSD, suicidal ideation, depression.
Let me just say, you are a heroine. Seriously.
You're extraordinary, Carrie. You really are.
Yeah, really.
My hero in the book, and I say it over and over, actually, to me, my hero was God. And I walked away from God for about 12 years. I was agnostic because, as you can imagine, like somebody using the name of Jesus to abuse me, I'm not such a fan of Jesus. And so, but a theme, I eventually was baptized, as I mentioned, Episcopalian as an adult in 2017, after 12 years as an agnostic. A big part of why I chose to do that was because I understood, and a big theme in the book is the difference between God and religion. And from my perspective, it's the difference between heaven and hell. I mean, that's why, Frederick Douglass said, between the Christianity of Jesus and the Christianity of America, I recognize the widest possible difference. So I think that is a big part of why the church is suffering in America, is because there is this confusion of what is religion and what is God. God is love. God is the pure essence of love and life-giving abundance. Religion is a man-made, human, creaky institution. I would compare it similar to a political party versus an ideology. They're different things. And in the case of my father, it became an addiction for him. When you look at the brain patterns of someone who's involved in a cult, it's the same brain patterns as a drug addict, as an alcoholic. So these are things that people use to fill the void of purpose. It's a human-run thing when it's taken to an extreme.
I want to get both Anne first and then Debra in on going through these changes. How long will it take? Which will be the toughest one?
Well, I was going to say, Carrie, after hearing your story, I have nothing to complain about in my life ever. And Godspeed and God's peace be with you. But you hit the main point, and that is the changes are going to take a while. But I think we have a generation that's lost. They're looking for something, and hopefully God leads them back. And I think that is the case. The church has to return to God, has to stop playing the politics that it does and the divisiveness, and look at people as individuals and treat them with love and reach out with love. And I think the church will survive quite nicely if they do that.
But wait a second. You're assuming that lack of love or nastiness or child rape in the case of some of the Catholic prelates are why people left. What about education? That's the biggest reason. Certainly why Catholic women in Italy have the lowest birth rate in the world. Why? They also have the highest number of PhD women in the world. And
30% of young people, Bonnie, there's a book out that just said 30% of young people leaving the church and identifying as non-religious are people who believe the church is anti-science. So you're hitting the nail on the head that is a big part of it.
Well, except that education doesn't mean that you don't believe in God. So I mean,
exactly.
So
let me just say, to education, doesn't mean that you don't believe in God. Of course not. But the fact is, if you are educated, you are much less likely to believe in God.
Well, hopefully, again, their education leads them to greater enlightenment and they'll circle back.
I was educated in the church, the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, right in Alexandria, Virginia. My mom went to that school. I went to that school. I taught high school. I was like the best student in religion. I eventually left that church and left Missouri Synod Lutheran. I couldn't vote. There were not answers for me as a 13 and 14-year-old girl as to why the boys were allowed to do certain things and the girls couldn't. And I think it became even more clear to me. I left the church when I was in college. It just didn't fit with how I wanted to look at myself, self-respect, and why would I be in an organization that looks at me like I'm dirty? It just doesn't fit with education and today's modern woman.
I actually went to that church, Debra, in Alexandria. I went to like 2 services and left, went around the corner and joined an ELCA Lutheran church for exactly the reason.
Yeah, it's very conservative.
Let me just jump in with a story here that goes along with that. A good friend who used to be a regular on the show went to the old stone brick church, I think it is, in Alexandria. And there was a new priest. This was many years ago. And he looked around at a room full, the whole church full of congregants, all the ones of childbearing age and even, beyond childbearing age, had 2 children. And he said, which of you is a sinner and uses birth control? Raise your hand. I know who you are. That was the last time she and her husband went to that church.
Understandably.
That is something that I suppose that really hurts the church, because 98% of Catholic women have used birth control and a very high percentage have had abortions.
Melinda Gates is a very devout Catholic, and this has been an issue she's really been advocating and working on. And she has pretty good backup on it. The nuns from the high school where she attended, who back her on this issue. So there are a lot of opinions, and I think that everyone here is right that religion moves at a snail's pace in terms of evolution, but God's love is something that's constant.
You're absolutely right about Melinda Gates. Our producer, Carrie Stein, interviewed her at a convocation of people who supported not necessarily birth control, but certainly services for pregnant women in developing nations. And this was one in Indonesia about 15 years ago. Melinda Gates has gone out of her way to support things like health services for women in poor countries, but not abortion. And the church still, at least last time I heard, this may be out of date by now, but for the longest time, at least for 15, 20 years, still banned her because she was supporting health services for women, minus abortion. What do people, is that the kind of thinking that has to change?
As a Protestant, I don't believe the Bible supports the notion that birth control is sinful. I don't believe that. I am personally pro-life. So I do believe there is biblical evidence to say that abortion is wrong, that it's the taking of innocent life. So I think there is a big distinction, but therein lies the difference for me as a Protestant versus a Catholic. I don't believe in the piling on of dogma that adds on a bunch more rules that aren't in the Bible. So that's where I would agree with Melinda Gates if she's helping with birth control versus abortion. I would say, just going back to the bigger conversation on the correlation between education and agnostic or atheist or non-believer, as a recovered agnostic who went to Harvard, while I was at Harvard, I was agnostic. I tried to avoid Christians. I thought they were, like Keli referenced, I thought Christians were either bigoted or just deluded, and I didn't want them in my life. And now here I am. But the thing is, I was confusing wisdom with knowledge. And I think that's what's happened in our education system. Because if you look back at the Cambridge University, Oxford University, Harvard University, they were founded by Christian leaders to be sources of knowledge within the Christian tradition. Harvard was founded, the original motto in Latin was truth for Christ and the church. It was actually created to train theologians. Harvard.
But wait a minute. Back then, churches were the only places we didn't have a public school system. There wasn't anything paid for by states or the feds. So churches were the only places to start schools, and including, the places, universities, etc. In the early days, that was true. It was certainly true in Europe for Oxford and Cambridge, and it was true in this country for the Ivy League schools, including mine, Columbia. So, and including in Washington, D.C., Georgetown, started by Jesuits.
That was all part of the process. I mean,
right, and that's what I'm saying is like there's a rich heritage of intellectual inquiry. The scientific process was created by a devout Christian. So the notion that any Christian who's afraid of science, or that somehow you should be terrified of the scientific process, learn history, learn that the scientific process was created by Christians to understand the eloquence of God. There's a wonderful ministry called Science Plus God. It was created by a former Harvard physics professor named Michael Gillen. He has 3 PhDs from Cornell in physics, mathematics, and astronomy. It shows how God is revealed in science. Same thing with the work of Einstein, who was Jewish. He said that science reveals the mind of God. So I think that it's perfectly compatible.
As a woman, not being able to vote, having to be silent in the church, or actually being allowed to do things, but we won't acknowledge that you're doing them. That's a problem for women today, especially in highly educated countries. I'm not saying the church
on that point, Keli, do you believe that it's going to be harder for Catholics to give church power within the church to women than it is going to be to accept LGBTQ people as congregants with full rights as congregants?
Probably, because I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but I know one of the things that has been, revealed as more and more, as there becomes more transparency, is that some of the male leadership within the Catholic Church, I'm not talking about popes, have had same-sex relationships. That's something that has now become more public. I hope I'm not causing trouble. I'm not trying to gossip, but it's something that's been discussed. And I think one of the things we can kind of all agree on is that an institution is really only as good as its leadership. There's a reason why corporations that have more women in positions of power actually tend to thrive more than those that don't. And so I think this might be a really slow turn, since there are not women in positions of power within the church, right? That's going to hinder its ability to evolve. But at some point it's going to have to, because if not, it'll die. The last thing I'll say too, that I think is probably the biggest difference between Protestants and Catholics, I've only visited Catholic Church a couple times, is I joke that one of the great joys of Protestantism is, if you don't like a pastor, you don't like a message, you don't like another member, you go across the street, someone else has founded a new church. And it's a joke, but it is kind of the reality. Catholicism is kind of the biggest corporation in religion. And so, as we've all seen with institutions, the larger an institution, the harder it is to change.
I would like to say something that I've noticed. The church that's growing most quickly in Central and South America and in the United States are the evangelical Christians. We haven't even talked about them.
The people who really stay active in communities of faith, one of the things that data has shown across the board years and years is that one of the reasons that believers tend to have longer or healthier lives is because of a sense of community. I had hip surgery a few years ago in Los Angeles, and I had a family member who came to help take care of me, but my church was very clear out there: you need us, we will send someone who will stay with you at your home to take care of you. That kind of goes.
Mormons do that as well. Mormons are very good about that.
I was dating someone who at the time who was not a believer, and he hadn't been in a church since he was a child. The church he went to was still doing the chanting in Latin. So that's the kind of church it was. And so he said, well, can I tag along? I said, yeah, I'm going to church Sunday. And he walks in. There were dogs there because they say if you need to bring a dog, you can bring the dog. There were gay couples there. The choir was every race under the sun. It was not his image of what a church looks like. And most of the conversation was about volunteer opportunities within the community. So is just reinforcing it's not just about the music. It's not just about the, it at its best, it should be a community about love, faith, and support. That's how I envision it, which I think is the way I interpret his message.
And Kelly's making an extremely important point. We have such a generation of lost people. I mean, really. And I really do think there will be a pendulum swinging back. I think a lot of the churches are adapting and are providing safe spaces for people, spaces where people of different backgrounds can come and talk and congregate together. I've seen it in my own church, which is very welcoming to gay community and also Black community and all minorities. And it's really evolving. And I really think that that is the future. I think we've hit sort of the low point, and I'm hoping if this country is going to find its way, it's going to need to find its way back to God.
All right. Thank you all for a fascinating discussion. I have always said that if atheism could develop community the way churches could, atheism would be a heck of a lot more popular, but it's not. That's it for this edition. Please keep the conversation going on our host of social media platforms. Reach out to us at To The Contrary and visit our website. The address is on the screen. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
You're watching PBS.